The wind cut through the dry canyon like the whisper of a blade. Dust swirled in the dying light as Ethan Cole tightened his grip on the worn leather reins of his horse. He rode alone, as he had for the past year, a ghost drifting through the remnants of a world that no longer needed men like him. His rifle rested across his lap, his revolver strapped to his thigh, both relics of a war that had ended, though it still lived in the scars on his body and the shadows in his mind. The land stretched vast and endless, a wilderness that swallowed the weak. Ethan wasn't weak, but he was tired. His heart was a hollow thing, beating only because it hadn't yet learned how to stop. He had no home, no destination, only an aimless path through a country that had torn itself apart and left men like him to wander its broken pieces. Then he heard it, a sharp crack, gunfire. He pulled his horse to a stop, breath stilling. A second shot rang out, echoing off the cliffs. Then a scream, raw and desperate. His fingers tightened on the reins. This wasn't his fight. He'd had his fill of war, of death. But the scream came again, a woman's voice, high with terror. Ethan cursed under his breath and nudged his horse forward, guiding it toward the noise. The terrain sloped downward into a dry riverbed, the banks steep, lined with jagged rock and brittle sagebrush. He slid from the saddle, moving low, silent. Below, 3 men stood in a loose semicircle around a woman. She was young, her dark hair falling in tangled waves over her shoulders, her skin rich and sun-worn. A Navajo. Her hands were bound, her dress torn at the sleeve. Blood trickled from a gash on her temple. Her gaze flickered wildly between the men, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. One of the men, stocky, with a thick beard and a stained vest, holstered his pistol and stepped toward her. "You got nowhere left to run, girl," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "Ain't no use making this harder than it has to be." She didn't answer. Her jaw clenched, her fingers curling into fists. The bearded man chuckled, glancing at his companions. "Feisty one, ain't she?" The tallest of the 3, a wiry man with a rifle slung over his shoulder, spat into the dirt. "Feisty don't matter. Bounty's the same whether she's got fight in her or not." Ethan's stomach twisted. He'd seen enough in his time to know what came next. He exhaled slowly, considering his odds. 3 of them. He had the high ground, the element of surprise. If he timed it right, he stepped forward, cocking his rifle. "I'd walk away if I were you." The men jerked toward the sound, hands darting for their weapons. Ethan held his aim steady. "Wouldn't do that. You pull iron, you won't have time to use it." The bearded man squinted up at him. "And who the hell are you?" Ethan ignored the question. "Let her go." The wiry man chuckled. "This here's legal business. Girl's got a bounty. You got no part in this." Ethan's grip on the rifle didn't waver. "What's the charge?" The third man, squat and broad-shouldered, sneered. "Killed a man in Silver Creek. Doesn't matter why. There's gold for her head, and we aim to collect." Ethan glanced at the woman. She met his eyes, her face unreadable. There was no fear in her gaze, only defiance. "How much?" Ethan asked. The bearded man grinned. $200. Ethan nodded, considering. Then he pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the canyon, and the wiry man crumpled, a hole punched clean through his chest. The other 2 lunged for their weapons, but Ethan was already moving. He fired again, hitting the squat man in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The bearded man got his pistol free, but Ethan was faster. He swung the butt of his rifle into the man's jaw, sending him crashing to the dirt. A second later, he was on top of him, driving his knee into the man's chest, pressing his revolver to his forehead. "Should have walked away," Ethan said. The man's eyes were wide with fear, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. His hand twitched toward his belt. Ethan cocked the revolver's hammer. "Try it, and I'll leave you for the coyotes." The man hesitated, then went still. Ethan slowly eased back, keeping his gun trained on him. "Get your friend and ride out of here. If I see you again, you won't get another chance." The squat man groaned, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The bearded man scrambled to his feet, throwing one last glare at Ethan before grabbing his wounded companion and dragging him toward the horses. Within minutes, they were gone, dust rising behind them. Ethan turned to the woman. She was already working at the rope around her wrists, her fingers deft and practiced. He reached for his knife, but she shook her head, tearing the last knot free herself. "You hurt?" he asked. She wiped the blood from her temple, wincing slightly. "I've had worse." Ethan nodded. He studied her for a moment, then gestured to his horse. "You got somewhere to go?" Her gaze flickered toward the horizon, unreadable. "Not anymore." Ethan exhaled through his nose, considering. He didn't need a companion. He didn't want one. But something about her, the way she held herself, the way she had looked at him without fear, kept him from walking away. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Lena." "Ethan," he said. She nodded, as if committing it to memory. The wind had picked up again, howling through the canyon. The sun was nearly gone, the sky painted in shades of ember and smoke. Ethan glanced toward the horizon. Those men weren't the type to give up easy. They'd be back. He sighed. "We need to move." Lena hesitated only a moment before nodding. Ethan climbed into the saddle, then extended a hand. She stared at it, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly she took it. As they rode into the falling night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped onto a path he could never turn back from. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The night stretched wide and empty, the desert bathed in silver light beneath a restless moon. Ethan kept his horse moving at a steady pace, feeling the warmth of Lena pressed against his back. She rode behind him, her grip loose around his waist, but he could feel the tension in her body. She wasn't used to trusting men like him. He didn't blame her. He wasn't sure he trusted himself either. The desert had its own voice at night. Wind whispered through brittle sagebrush. Coyotes howled from distant ridges, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out, hunting in silence. Ethan listened, always listening. The bounty hunters would return. That was a certainty. A man didn't lose $200 and simply let it go. Lena shifted slightly, and he felt her fingers tighten against his coat. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a murmur. "North," he answered. "There's a settlement a few days out. You got people there?" She was quiet for a long moment. "No." Ethan didn't push. He wasn't a man who asked questions unless he needed answers. Whatever past she carried, it was hers to keep. He had enough ghosts of his own. The land sloped downward into a narrow wash, the rocky ground uneven beneath his horse's hooves. He slowed, scanning the shadows. The canyon walls pressed in around them, tall and jagged, the kind of place a man could get trapped if he wasn't careful. Lena stiffened behind him. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. He pulled up, instinct prickling the back of his neck. "What?" She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. He turned his horse sharply, moving them toward higher ground. The instant they crested the ridge, he saw them. 3 riders, moving fast. Ethan's stomach knotted. The bounty hunters had found their trail. "Hold on," he muttered. He spurred the horse forward, cutting across the ridge in a desperate attempt to outpace them. The ground was treacherous, loose gravel sliding beneath them as the wind howled through the pass. A gunshot cracked, a bullet sparking off the rocks to their left. Lena tensed against him. He felt her breath hitch, but she didn't cry out. She wasn't the type. Ethan leaned low over the saddle, urging the horse faster. The land opened up ahead, a stretch of dry grass, broken by a line of thick brush. If they could make it there, they have a chance. Another shot rang out. The horse jerked beneath him, stumbling as the bullet grazed its flank. Ethan swore, tightening his grip on the reins. He could hear the riders gaining. He yanked the rifle from its scabbard, twisting in the saddle. 3 shots left. He lined up his aim, exhaled, and fired. The lead rider's horse screamed as the bullet struck its flank. The man tumbled, crashing hard against the dirt. The others pulled up short, their shouts lost to the wind. Ethan didn't wait to see if they'd recover. He drove his heels into the horse's sides, pushing forward with everything they had left. The brush loomed ahead, thick and tangled. He could feel Lena clinging tighter, bracing for impact. They hit the undergrowth at full speed, branches clawing at them as they crashed through. Thorns ripped at Ethan's coat, tore his skin. The horse stumbled, nearly throwing them both, but somehow stayed upright. And then, silence. Ethan pulled up, his breath ragged. The hunters hadn't followed. They knew better than to charge blind into unfamiliar terrain. He turned his head slightly. Lena's arms were still tight around him, her breath coming fast. "Still with me?" he asked. She loosened her grip, but didn't answer right away. "They'll come back." He knew she was right. They dismounted near a cluster of boulders, their only real cover. Ethan pulled his canteen, took a quick drink, then handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it, tilting it back for a brief sip. "You know this land," he said. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Some of it. Then you know a way out of here." She glanced toward the distant hills. "We keep moving north, we'll find water. If we don't, we won't last another day." Ethan nodded. The desert wasn't forgiving. He had learned that long ago. They moved quickly, keeping low, their path weaving through the scattered rocks and dry brush. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and something distant, something sharp and electric. Ethan paused, lifting his face slightly. He knew that scent. "Storm's coming," he muttered. Lena turned her gaze skyward. The clouds were darker now, rolling in thick waves across the moonlit sky. She didn't need to say it. They both knew. Storms in the desert weren't just rain. They were fury, sudden and violent. They pressed forward, urgency quickening their pace. The land sloped downward again, leading them into a shallow ravine. The air had shifted, thick with the weight of something impending. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape for an instant. Ethan caught sight of a shadow on the ridge, a figure, motionless, watching. His hand went to his revolver, but before he could draw, the figure disappeared. Lena had seen it too. She moved closer, voice low. "Not bounty hunters." "Then who?" She shook her head. "Could be Apache. Could be someone else." Ethan exhaled, tension coiling in his chest. He didn't like unknowns. The first drops of rain hit the ground like scattered bullets. A gust of wind howled through the ravine, sending a shower of dust and grit into the air. They needed shelter. Lena pointed ahead. There, a rock overhang, just large enough to keep them dry. Ethan didn't hesitate. They reached it just as the storm broke, rain hammering the earth in a torrential sheet. Ethan crouched against the rock, his body aching from the ride. Lena sat a few feet away, silent. He studied her in the dim light. The wound on her temple had stopped bleeding, but her face was drawn, exhausted. "You should rest," he said. She let out a quiet breath. "I can't." Ethan understood. He hadn't truly rested in years. The storm raged on, wind howling through the canyon like the cries of the dead. Ethan kept his rifle close, eyes scanning the darkness. Then he felt it. A presence. A shift in the air. He turned his head slowly. A man stood at the mouth of the overhang. Tall, silent, eyes dark and unreadable. Lena stiffened. Ethan didn't move. The stranger stepped forward, his movements deliberate, controlled. He was dressed in buckskin, a knife at his hip, a bow slung across his back. His face was lined, hardened by years of survival. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the man's gaze settled on Ethan. "You bring trouble here." His voice was deep, steady. Ethan met his stare, unflinching. Not by choice. The man's expression didn't change. Choice don't matter. Trouble follows. Ethan didn't argue. He knew it was true. Lena shifted slightly. "Who are you?" she asked. The man's gaze flicked to her. A pause. Then Takuta. Ethan recognized the name. He had heard it whispered in frontier towns. A warrior, a ghost of the land, a man who moved unseen. Takuta's gaze returned to Ethan. "The men who hunt you, they will not stop." Ethan nodded. "I figured." Takuta studied him for a long moment, then turned to Lena. "You are far from your people." She lifted her chin. "I have my reasons." Takuta seemed to consider this. Then he stepped back into the rain. "Follow me." Ethan hesitated, but Lena was already moving. He exhaled, gripping his rifle tighter. Then he followed. The storm swallowed them whole. The night was a breath away from breaking when they reached the ridge overlooking the town. Below, Silver Creek lay still, the lanterns from saloons casting an amber glow over the dirt streets. A hush lingered, the kind that spoke of bad men waiting in the dark. Ethan crouched beside Dakota, his rifle braced against his knee. Lena knelt close, her gaze sharp as she scanned the buildings. She had been here before. This was where her war had begun. Marshall Hunt was somewhere inside that town. The man who had sent riders to burn her home. The man whose bounty hunters had hunted her across the desert. The man who had taken everything from her and called it justice. Ethan adjusted his grip on his rifle. He had spent a lifetime carrying the weight of war. He had sworn not to pick up another. And yet here he was. Dakota spoke low, his voice calm. 2 men on the balcony, another by the livery. More inside. Ethan nodded. That meant Hunt wasn't alone. Lena's jaw was tight, her breath steady but controlled. He could see it in her eyes, the same fire he had seen the first time he found her in the canyon. A storm, quiet but dangerous. "You don't have to do this," he said. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, I do." She moved before he could say more, slipping through the rocks and down toward the town's edge. Dakota followed without a word. Ethan exhaled slowly, then went after them. The town smelled of whiskey and sweat, the stench of men who had forgotten what it meant to be decent. The 3 of them moved like shadows through the alleys, keeping low, unseen. The saloon was their destination. Hunt would be inside. Lena slid up against the wooden frame of the back entrance, listening. Voices drifted from inside, low, gruff, men laughing over drinks. The kind of laughter that came easy to killers. Dakota nodded once. "I'll cover the front." Ethan touched Lena's arm. "Stay close." She gave him a look. "You stay close." He almost smiled. Then they moved. Ethan pushed the door open, stepping inside with his revolver drawn. The air was thick with smoke and sweat. A few men sat at the tables, their heads snapping up at the intrusion. He ignored them. He was only looking for one man. Marshall Hunt sat in the corner, a bottle in his grip, his hat tilted just enough to shadow his eyes. He didn't startle, didn't even flinch, just took a slow drink, as if he had been expecting this. Lena stepped in behind Ethan, her knife glinting at her hip. Hunt sighed, setting the bottle down. "Figured you'd come knocking sooner or later, girl." His voice was slow, deliberate. Ethan watched his hands. A man like Hunt didn't get old by being careless. "You sent men to kill me," Lena said. Her voice was quiet but steady. Hunt tilted his head, considering. "I sent men to do the law's work." "The law?" Ethan scoffed. "That what you call it?" Hunt finally looked at him. "And you must be the fool who got in the way." Ethan didn't move. "Seems that way." Hunt's fingers tapped against the table. "You ever fight a war, son?" Ethan's grip tightened. "I fought yours." Hunt smiled, slow and knowing. "Then you already know how this ends." The room was silent. Then Lena moved. It happened fast. Hunt lunged, his hand going for the gun at his hip. But Ethan was faster. His revolver barked, the shot tearing through the table, forcing Hunt back. The saloon exploded into motion. Chairs scraped, men scrambled, and the bartender dove for cover. Hunt fired, the bullet slicing past Ethan's shoulder. Lena darted forward, her knife flashing. Hunt twisted at the last second, her blade catching his coat instead of his throat. Dakota burst through the front, his rifle cracking. One of Hunt's men dropped, blood splattering the floorboards. Ethan moved, his body a weapon forged by too many fights. He hit Hunt hard, knocking them both into a table. Wood splintered beneath them. Hunt grunted, wrenching his gun free. Ethan slammed his forearm against Hunt's wrist, the revolver clattering to the ground. Hunt was strong, mean, a man who had survived on brutality alone. But Ethan was tired of men like this. He drove his fist into Hunt's ribs, then again, until the man gasped for breath. Lena stood over them, her knife poised. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, heavy breaths. Hunt coughed, spitting blood. "Go on, girl," he rasped. "Do what you came here to do." Lena didn't move. Ethan saw the war inside her. He understood it. She had spent so long running, fighting. She had dreamed of this moment, of vengeance. But now, standing over the man who had stolen everything from her. She hesitated. She wasn't a killer. Not like Hunt. Ethan reached out, touching her arm. You end him now. You carry him forever. Her grip on the knife tightened. Hunt smiled, teeth stained red. That's the thing about revenge, girl. It don't change a damn thing. Lena exhaled. Then she stepped back. Ethan nodded. Then he turned to Hunt, his voice low. You leave this town. You leave this land. And if I ever see you again, I'll finish what she started. Hunt laughed, shaking his head. You think I'm the only one who wants her dead? Ethan didn't flinch. Don't matter. You won't be around to see it. Hunt's smile faltered. Dakota grabbed him by the collar, yanking him to his feet. Without another word, he dragged Hunt through the shattered saloon doors and out into the night. The room was quiet now. Ethan turned to Lena. She was staring at the knife in her hand, her expression unreadable. You all right? He asked. She closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. It's over. Ethan looked around at the wreckage. Not sure the town will agree. She almost smiled. They stepped out into the cool air, the dawn creeping over the horizon. Dakota was waiting. He'll live, the warriors said. For now. Ethan glanced at Lena. What now? She looked at him, then at the rising sun. I don't know. Ethan nodded. He understood. He had spent years searching for a purpose, and now, standing beside her, he realized he had found one. He reached for his horse, then hesitated. Lena, he said. She turned. He met her gaze, steady and certain. You're not alone. She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. They rode out together, the past finally behind them.